am super excited to bring you another episode of The Fire Pit with Danielle Moody. Today, I am joined by author Danny Goldberg, who is the author of a new book, Liberals with Attitude: The Rodney King Beating and the Fight for the Soul of Los Angeles. I found this to be a really interesting topic, particularly in this day and age. And, Danny, I want to turn it over to you because your background, I mean, from music to the ACLU to author, journalist, give us a little bit more info about who you are and why this book right now.
Well, I've been in the music business for many decades. First as a journalist, then a personal manager. I ran big record companies for a while, and at the same time, I've been an activist. And most notably, the most activist time in my life is when I was living in Los Angeles in the late 1980s and early 90s, where I got the honor of being asked to be the chair of the ACLU Foundation of Southern California, which then and now is the biggest ACLU in the country, the most progressive. Southern California has policies about economic rights as well as free speech and other things like that. And the Rodney King beating took place right in the middle of the time that I was ACLU chair. And I just thought that as I looked at what's going on in the world today, in America today, that it was worth focusing on kind of a rare progressive victory on the subject of law enforcement and race, because it's so hard to make any progress on those issues because of the ability of demagogues to manipulate public fear of crime into not making any reforms. I mean, after the George Floyd murder, the Congress did not pass anything new.
Nope.
Even they wouldn't even create a database so that if a police officer was proved to have been brutal in one area and they applied for a job in another, that information was not available. Even that reform was too much of a stretch. And so that's basically the story. My day job has been in the music business. I still have a little management company. In the 90s, I was one of the managers of Nirvana, which is kind of my biggest claim to fame in the music business.
Amazing.
I earlier had done publicity for Led Zeppelin, and then I was president of Atlantic Records, which happened right after the time that I'm writing about in the book. The reason I wrote it was, firstly, I just wanted to focus on some heroic people that I thought had been kind of forgotten and who meant a lot to me. And, it's hard to describe. I know we were talking before this that you're working on a book, what it takes to just decide to do a book. But
Yeah.
I just, over the period of time, developed a level of intensity that I wanted to tell the story of how they were able to get rid of a racist police chief who had enormous power. And if you want, I could describe a little about that guy.
So, what I think is really interesting, and again, folks who are just joining us, sitting down fireside with the Fire Pit with Danny Goldberg, who's the author of Liberals with Attitude: The Rodney King Beating and the Fight for the Soul of Los Angeles. And Danny, what I think is really interesting, and I just want you to frame it up for us, for people who are super young, who they may have an idea of Rodney King, like that name may ring a bell, but they may not understand the intensity of that time period in that moment. And what you and I were speaking of, and I want to bring watchers into this, the Rodney King beating was the first videotaped assault on an unarmed Black man. We take that kind of for granted now, that we are so used to scrolling through and seeing trauma play out in our devices, that in 1991, a bystander had a camcorder and filmed the beating of Rodney King by 4 police officers. And that video, that grainy video, I vaguely remember, was played across news stations and around, the country. So I just want you to be able to kind of frame up the video and why it was so like why it was so impactful, gut-wrenching, etc.
Well, I'll talk about the video. I also, it might be worth after I'm done just trying to explain what the situation was in Los Angeles in the years leading up to the video.
Yeah.
Because the Los Angeles Police Department up until that time was really had a unique status in America in terms of the complete autonomy that the chief had and the sh- blatant racism of the chief. We think of LA as kind of a liberal mecca, but it wasn't always so liberal. But to go to your original question, yeah, we now all have these devices with cameras on them, and we take it for granted. Cell phones and the internet were brand new in the early 1990s. There was the only kind of cell phones that existed were these heavy things that you could put in a car, and they did not have cameras. And video recording had prior to that time been, prohibitively expensive for most people. But this product that you described called the camcorder had just been introduced, and it was under $1,000, and it became a gift item for middle class people. And there was a plumber named George Holliday who had just gotten one in March of 1991 when he heard this disturbance outside of his apartment window in a section of L.A. And Rodney King had been speeding. He was 30-something-year-old black man. He had been speeding. He had been drinking. Um, he was pulled over after a chase of a few miles. All of that is within what law enforcement's supposed to do if you're speeding. But what they're not supposed to do is then beat him dozens and dozens of times with metal batons. And it wasn't only that 4 police officers did it while he was writhing on the ground in pain, unarmed, I might add. But 20 other police officers watched while this was happening. And none of it was reported, but the video was delivered to a local LA TV station the next day. Rodney King's brother tried to make a complaint and, got nowhere because there was no complaint system set up in the LAPD at that
Hmm.
time for police brutality that had any real meaning to it. And by the next day, it was on CNN. It was a quirk of historical fate on the date that this happened because CNN had risen to popularity as a result of the Gulf War, which started a couple of, about a year earlier or two earlier. It became ubiquitous in America and all over the world because they had 24/7 coverage of the war. That
Hmm.
war ended 3 days before the King beating. So they had nothing to play with violence on it, with the kind of thing that would
Yep.
get audiences. So they played it dozens and dozens of times. It got picked up by all the other TV networks at a time when TV networks had far greater viewership than they do today. And polls showed that 75% of all Americans and over 90% of people in Los Angeles saw that video. It became iconic almost immediately. Years later, Al Sharpton referred to the Rodney King video as the Jackie Robinson of police videos. Spike Lee used it in the opening credits of his film about Malcolm X, Malcolm,
Yep.
and it reached into a place, particularly with white people who didn't know that the LAPD behaved that way. I lived in a nice neighborhood in Hollywood where the police were quite pleasant when I had run into them. But because of my work for the ACLU, who had a police brutality hotline for years leading up to this, I learned that they acted very, very differently in black neighborhoods. And if I could give one example of
Please.
the police chief, Daryl Gates, who was the prime villain in my book, a
Yep.
Trumpian villain, I might add. The shorthand to describe his attitudes about race occurred about 10 years earlier, um, when it was disclosed that 15 men in LA had been killed by police chokeholds in the previous couple of years, a few year period in which no other American city had more than one such killing. And of those 15, 80% of them were black in a city with only 18% black population. So an LA Times reporter asked Gates, did he think there was possibly some implicit racism on the parts of some of his officers, given the tremendous disparity. And he said, "Oh no, we're finding that the arteries in the necks of black men are different than those of normal people." That was such a devastatingly racist and terrible thing to say. You would think it would have gotten him fired, but it didn't because of the enormous power that he had in the city council. Although Maxine Waters, who was the first person I spoke to when I was writing this book, at the time, she had been in the California State Assembly and then just entered the U.S. Congress the year of the Rodney King beating. She had called for Gates's resignation right away, 10 years before the Rodney King, as she called for Trump's resignation first of anyone
Mhm.
in the country. And after the George Floyd murder, she and Karen Bass, who was an anti-police brutality activist in LA at the time of the King beating, both said that it brought back memories of Daryl Gates's behavior and attitude about black life and black people. So there had been many other incidents where blacks and Mexican Americans and other Latinos had been beaten, some of them to death by police, but not captured on video. The ACLU would win millions of dollars a year in lawsuits because of racist behavior of the LAPD. They pulled over Baseball Hall of Famer Joe Morgan in the LA airport, and roughed him up. And then later said that they had him confused with someone who was suspected of drug dealing. He sued them successfully for $500,000 and so on and so forth. So when the beating happened, Police Chief Gates, who is very politically smart, described it as an aberration. But
Mhm.
as Jesse Jackson said at a rally a week later, the aberration wasn't the beating. The aberration was that it was captured on video.
Yep.
And that video changed the political reality about the LAPD in Los Angeles. And that's what the book is about. At the time, the mayor of Los Angeles was Tom Bradley, who'd been the first black mayor of LA and one of the first black mayors in the United States. He'd been elected in 1973. He was elected a total of 5 times, still a record for mayors of big cities, and he knew he was approaching retirement. He was not a progressive. He was what we would today call a corporate Democrat, a centrist. He was very close to the business community. Him and Maxine Waters often disagreed about who should be on the city council and different allocation of funds. But Bradley had begun his career as an officer on the LAPD. He and Daryl Gates had known each other for 40 years, and they had hated each other for 40 years. And when Bradley was on the police force, it was not permitted for black and white officers to ride in the same police car. He
That's
knew what the
crazy.
culture he knew what the culture was of the department. But he was a risk-averse politician who didn't like to enter battles he couldn't win. He had a lot of other agendas. He came under a lot of criticism sometimes earlier, prior to the King beating, of not being sufficiently confrontational with the police chief. But the police chiefs in LA at that time were virtually unfireable. The mayor certainly couldn't fire him. There had been a set of procedures built into city equivalent of the city constitution, the LA City Charter in the 1930s, that made it virtually impossible to get rid of an LA police chief. Plus, Daryl Gates was very charismatic, very media savvy, knew how to manipulate the fear of crime at a time when the crack epidemic was raging and there was gang warfare in LA. And he had a unit of about 100 cops that spied on local politicians and got personal information on them. This is not a rumor. There was a book written by one of the sergeants who was ordered by Daryl Gates to get private information on local politicians. So he was very hard to get rid of Gates. But Bradley saw that the revulsion that moderates had, that a majority had to the King beating, gave him an opportunity to do what he had felt he couldn't do earlier. And the book describes a 16-month process, kind of the cast of characters he put together from the center and the left, and even a couple of Republicans, from the business community, from the activist community, and the media, to sustain focus on the horror of the King beating, sustain focus on the systemic racism and brutality that was in the department, finally get coerce Gates out of power, and get a ballot initiative passed revising the city charter so that today LA, although it has problems with race and policing like every city in America, has a normal structure where there's some accountability of the department to the rest of city government the way other American cities do. So it was a rare progressive, or to use the word Bradley would use, liberal victory on issues of race and law enforcement. And that's why I really wanted to do the book, to show it can be done, even though the
Right.
society was unable to respond in a useful way to George Floyd. It can be done. And I think Bradley's genius was understanding that he needed to create a left-center coalition among people who disagreed on other issues, but who could join together on that one focused issue. And I think that's what we need now with a authoritarian, quasi-fascist, federal government, where the bitterness between the center and the left is a luxury we can't afford in dealing with that. We can argue about things later on, whether you want Medicare for all or not. I do. I'm a Bernie Sanders type Democrat, but I think that Bradley, as a moderate and kind of an icon of the old school Democratic establishment, is a good role model for today's moderates who, to me, don't understand the necessity of a coalition with the left the way Bradley did.
Let me ask you this, because like you just provided such deep historical context, and just listening to the pieces that again are in your book, and for folks that are just joining, the book by Danny Goldberg is Liberals with Attitude: The Rodney King Beating and the Fight for the Soul of Los Angeles. And what I think is really interesting is this idea, we look at Donald Trump right now and the mechanisms that he is using to um get revenge, right? Retribution on his enemies, right? And we think that what he is doing with ICE is new. And what you just offered to us, and what you provide a window to in your book, is that these types of um police policing activities that spy on politicians, that spy on organizers, that try and infiltrate different groups and push back against those that are fighting, whether it be for Black liberation, Latino liberation, et cetera, are not new. Right? Like J. Edgar Hoover was the one who created the blueprint on how you
Right.
disrupt organizing for equity and for justice, particularly through the lens of Black people. So I want to get your thoughts on, do you believe that now, given how divided, I mean, the time frame in which you're talking about, and even the history that you offered, was an incredibly divisive time. Now we're in a different level and space of divisiveness that is created through disinformation and misinformation and all of these things. Do you think that it's possible for moderates to connect with liberals, to connect with progressives on this issue, given the fact that we watched a 9-minute video of George Floyd having the life pressed out of him and couldn't get change, the kind of change that resulted in the firing of this police chief that you follow in your book, that we
Well,
couldn't get anything done for George
yeah.
Floyd and his family decades later?
Well, I don't know about the civil lawsuits by the family. I know in terms of changing national policy or creating national standards of law enforcement behavior, the effort in Congress failed. That failed because of the filibuster and the refusal of the leaders of the Democratic Party to get rid of the filibuster. Now, of course, Trump wants to get rid of the filibuster for his own reasons. I think that you have to look. There's so much has changed. Technology has changed mostly. The demographics have changed to a certain extent. Politics has changed. The media has changed dramatically. But the psychological issues that drive politics haven't changed that much. The susceptibility, Tom Hayden was a great anti-war leader who I admired a lot and who was part of the LA community during the period I'm writing about. Said that what happens, that change in society is a struggle between what he called movements and Machiavellians, and he said when movements can get the support of moderate Machiavellians, that's when change happens. Dr. King said the same thing. He said the biggest obstacle to progress in his time of activism, was persuading moderate whites. There's always going to be the racist, virulently racist minority. This goes back to the Civil War and Native American genocide and everything. But the political power still, there is a swing vote. And popular opinion still matters. That doesn't mean that elections are always fair. It doesn't mean that money doesn't distort things. Disinformation, though, is not new. There's a more sophisticated way of doing disinformation now. But when Bradley was first running for mayor in '69, they photoshopped a picture of him with Eldridge Cleaver of the Black Panthers. They never
Yep.
met in real life.
Mm.
There was a picture of him with his advisors, which was an integrated group of advisors, and they eliminated all the white faces from it and took an ad saying, "We want a mayor for our city." That was in '69, and he lost that race, but he was so resilient and brilliant politically, he was able to come back and then win the next 5 times. So what I think is worth focusing on are look, the mechanics of the media are incredibly important, and we need people that understand and who are modern thinking and forward thinking about this moment in time. But the spiritual and moral issues and the struggle between fear of crime on one side and a desire for morality that includes everybody on the other, that's the same struggle. And the examples of how that battle was fought to me are relevant to today, even though so much has changed. But there's always been disinformation. It's again, you can do it more in a sophisticated way now. It just blows my mind. We're speaking today in New York City on election day. I'm a Mamdani supporter. I can't believe it's just some of the blatant lies that that
Yep.
that, that opponents just repeat and repeat, and you see it on social media. I see it on my social media. But there were enormous amount of political lying in the past. Any study of history will show you that, going for the entire history of the country. The challenge is to overcome that, you need coalitions. That the left can't do it themselves. That's what we learned with the Bernie Sanders campaign. But the center can't do it themselves either. That's what we
Mhm.
learned with the recent election. And I think the bitterness between people on the left and the center is often just as great, if not greater, than that with the right. And that's just a luxury that we can't afford. There's areas where we can have arguments, but we have to first see if we can preserve something resembling a democracy. And I think that's where the lessons of what Tom Bradley did in the early '90s. He used culture. This was a time when rap was talking about the police department a lot. NWA's famous song "Fuck the Police" was not about police in general. It wasn't about all police. It was about Daryl Gates and those kinds of officers. There were people in the business community, and the argument for them was, "Oh, well, this is bad for business." There were people in the activist community where the argument was moral. But those kind of people who otherwise wouldn't really hang out together found ways of working together. So that's the only thing I can see. The only way out I
Yeah.
can see is to create a critical mass of public opinion, even though we don't have a real democracy given gerrymandering and money in politics. I do believe that if public opinion reaches a certain point, the dominoes start to fall in the right direction. There was this trivial example of this with Jimmy Kimmel, getting
Mhm.
fired,
Mhm.
and an outcry from people canceling their subscriptions to the Disney streaming channel made them reverse when all the other networks have caved in every time there's a problem. So that's the only thing I can think of is that to keep the eye focused on public opinion and to find ways of building coalitions that can actually get to a critical mass. But I also have a great personal nostalgia for the people that I admired. When I spoke to Representative Waters, she was saying she wishes there were statues of some of these people, because she knew them so well and worked with them. I just think we have a shortage of heroes, and some of the
Yeah.
people I wrote about to me acted heroically and could be role models for today. But I have to admit, on election day, cautiously optimistic about how it's going to feel tomorrow here in New York City.
Look, it's so I'm glad that you brought up the election. I have my sticker. I voted this morning, and I posted a video earlier about the fact that I haven't felt energized in the way that I'm feeling today with regard to voting for something as opposed to against something.
Right.
I feel like the last few elections that we have had have been about us voting against the oppressor, voting against misogyny. Kamala Harris was only given 107 days to convince America that it's not racist and misogynist, right? Like its twin original sins. And so today it felt like I was voting for the New York City that I want to live in. I'm voting for the country that I want to live in. And I want to remind people that are watching right now that election day is not the end, it's the beginning, right? Because we have to recognize that if we want to change the society that we live in, one person pinning our hopes and dreams on one person is not going to do that. We have to be a part of the infrastructure that is needed for the seismic shift that we want to see. And it doesn't just happen overnight, right? Like there needs to be a dedicated force and understanding that your civic duty doesn't end today. That it's something that is sparked today, and then you have to be a part of the change that you actually want to see. And know that Mamdani has not only the White House against him, but billionaire oligarchs against him. And against him, they are against us. They are against democracy. They are against the people. And so I think that it's important to use this as a starting point and not a finish line. But Danny, I have one more question for you before I let you go. And folks, again, Danny's book is Liberals with Attitude, The Rodney King Beating and the Fight for the Soul of Los Angeles. It is out now. It's been out for 3 weeks. It's fresh off the presses. So folks should go out and buy Danny's book, support fantastic journalism and writing. Danny, this show is called The Fire Pit, and I named it The Fire Pit because the fire pit is where folks gather, where we get to share stories, where we get to, put into the fire things that no longer serve us or things that we want to be cleansed. So the last question that I ask guests on The Fire Pit is, what are you putting into the fire pit today?
I would put into this metaphorical fire pit the parts of myself that want to dehumanize people that I disagree with. It's so easy as an activist to become self-righteous to the point of not actually understanding that people you disagree with have their own fears, their own ideals, and just have come to a different conclusion. I don't believe in departing from core moral values, but I do believe in trying to see humanity at people at a time when those very billionaires that you're referring to have algorithms designed to divide us from each other, and we know who wins when that happens. So I have my own prejudices against Republicans, for example, that I don't want to dehumanize people I disagree with. I
Yeah.
want to find the common humanity because to me, that's the only way of having the world that we want.
I love that so much. I love that. And I think that it is hard, particularly in these times when we are pit against one another, that the easiest thing to do is to dehumanize each other. And that to me is what has the opposition win, is when we all start to fall in line with their line of thinking. That means that there isn't room for the rest of us. Danny, this has been a fantastic conversation, and I'm really, really grateful for your time. Folks, again, the book is Liberals with Attitude, The Rodney King Beating and the Fight for the Soul of Los Angeles. It is out now. This video will be up and free for you all to share and post and like, but please go out and buy Danny's book. Any final thoughts for you, Danny, before we get out of here?
Danielle, I'm just so grateful to be able to talk to you about these things. And, let's still try to enjoy the minutes and hours of our life while we're dealing with these problems.
100%. Thank you all for joining. And another episode of The Fire Pit will be up soon, friends. Again, this is independent media. I put none of my content behind a paywall because that is where critical thinking goes to die. So if you have the ability to support, just hit subscribe. And if you have a few coins and can become a paid subscriber, do consider doing so. Danny, thank you so much.
Thanks again.
Appreciate you.